Hello and welcome back to World 360. Why has a Latin American country severed diplomatic ties with Israel? What's the connection between the resurgence of a terror group in the Democratic Republic of Congo, an upcoming election, and the African country's economy? And lastly, why was US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Senate hearing about funding for the Ukraine and Israel wars disrupted? We answer these and more in today's episode. So first up, Bolivia. This Latin American country, which has always had a rocky relationship with Israel, has become one of the first nations to cut ties with the country over its war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The government of leftist Luis Arce in Bolivia has cut ties with Israel, while its neighbors Colombia and Chile recall their ambassadors to the Middle Eastern country for consultations. Meanwhile, other Latin American countries such as Mexico and Brazil have called for a ceasefire in the war. What we have now is the insanity of Israel's Prime Minister who wants to wipe out the Gaza Strip, said Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva on Friday. Now on Tuesday, the Bolivian Deputy Foreign Minister announced the decision at a press conference. He alleged that Israel was responsible for war crimes and human rights abuses in the Gaza Strip. This comes just as Israel bombed Gaza's largest refugee camp in the Palestinian city of Jabalia. At least 50 Palestinians were killed and reportedly a Hamas commander too. It has been estimated that over 8,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza due to Israeli airstrikes since Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th. Meanwhile, over 1,400 Israelis have been killed since the war began and over 200 taken hostage by Hamas. Bolivia's decision doesn't come as much of a surprise, however. It was only in 2020 that the Latin American country, under the government of right-wing interim president Jeanine Áñez, re-established ties with Israel. Prior to that, in 2009, Bolivia cut diplomatic ties with Israel while leftist President Evo Morales was in power, in protest against the situation in Gaza. Evo Morales had at the time urged that Israeli President Shimon Peres and Prime Minister Ehud Olmert be declared war criminals. At the time, Venezuela also followed Bolivia's lead and cut ties with Israel too. This came after 19 days of Israeli air bombardments in Gaza that killed over roughly 1,000 people. In a way, we're seeing history repeat itself. Traditionally, the Palestinian cause has enjoyed a lot of support in Latin America. In 2010 and 2011, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Ecuador joined Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica in officially recognizing the Palestinian state. Mind you, most of these countries were run by leftist leaders at the time. In December 2017, however, Guatemala surprised many when it announced plans to relocate its embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. This was after the US, under the Trump administration, had done the same. That year, Guatemala had voted with the US on a non-binding resolution in the UN General Assembly on recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Other Latin American countries had abstained from the vote. For our second topic, we're looking at what's happening in this African state, the Democratic Republic of Congo, once a Belgian colony. If you're a regular viewer of this show, you know we've talked about the Democratic Republic of Congo many times, especially in terms of its rich minerals, like cobalt, that's used by Western countries for their green energy transition. But the presence of child labor in cobalt mines shows the underbelly, the ugly underbelly of this transition, and how this African country has often been seen as undergoing a form of modern exploitation of sorts. This is also a country that has struggled with armed violence from terror groups, political instability, and an abundance of minerals and resources eyed by foreign businesses. In the latest development, the country is in the midst of negotiating an economic lifeline from the IMF, just as a major terror group known as the M23 has reared its head once again. And on top of that, the African country will hold general elections in December, just 6 years after disputed elections had taken place in 2018. Currently, the country is being led by President Félix Antoine Tshisekedi, who is seeking re-election. However, his win in 2018 was widely disputed and opposition groups claimed voter fraud. But his term has been marked by economic mishaps, disease outbreaks like Ebola, and the resurgence of M23, which has further strained the country's relations with neighboring Rwanda. On 31st October this year, the IMF and the Congo government held their fifth round of talks for an extended credit facility. They also reached a staff-level agreement on economic policies that would further stabilize the economy, which is plagued by 80% debt of GDP and double-digit inflation. But see this interesting note issued by the IMF. Notwithstanding a difficult and uncertain environment, the economy remains resilient. Driven by a dynamic extractive sector, growth is expected to exceed 6% in 2023, it said. This shows that the cobalt sector, as well as the extraction of other precious minerals like copper, have helped keep the Congo economy more stable than in the past. In fact, earlier this year in May, the Democratic Republic of Congo and China agreed to upgrade ties to a comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership, in which Beijing pledged full support to the DRC's economic and social development. In a way, Congo's economy seems to be less worse off than before. At the same time, the M23 terror group has stepped up its attacks in the east near North Kivu. Nearly 2 lakh people have fled their homes since this recent resurgence of militia attacks. So if we go by the M23's tactics in the past, it has tried to choke off supply chain routes which have had a ripple effect on the economy. For example, back in December 2021, M23 rebels cut major supply routes in eastern Congo, which led to a rise of prices of basic goods like fuel. Will the M23 use a similar tactic as the political arena heats up in the Democratic Republic of Congo ahead of the elections? Only time will tell. For our last topic, we're looking at why US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Senate hearing about additional funding for the Ukraine and Israel wars was derailed. Take a look.
Not in the face of an intensifying strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific and around the world.
If the witness will suspend, and I ask that everyone again respect this hearing, we will suspend until the room is cleared.
Anti-war protesters, mainly elderly women, protested as Blinken tried to back the White House's request for over $70 billion to continue funding the Israel-Hamas war, as well as the Russia-Ukraine war. The protesters also repeatedly called for the US to urge a ceasefire in Gaza, just weeks after Washington had vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that called for just that. Right now, the US Congress has the power to approve funding for both Israel and Ukraine conflicts. The Biden administration just last month asked Congress to provide more than $105 billion in additional funding to bolster military assistance to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and the US border security. About $60 billion of that has been earmarked for Ukraine and $14 billion for Israel. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Blinken both testified before the Senate Appropriations Committee that there would be long-lasting implications for US national security if Congress didn't approve the funding. But Blinken fielded some difficult questions, especially in the aftermath of an Israeli bombing of a refugee camp. There was also the previous attack on a hospital in Gaza for which it was unclear who was responsible. Before we end the show, take a look at the line of questioning from one senator when he was addressing Blinken.
At a high level, can you tell me the amount of funding overall under your watch that's gone into Gaza?
So overall, we provided about $1 billion in assistance to the Palestinians through the UN Works and Relief Agency.
That's a significant amount of money. I look forward to going through the detailed response you provided. I appreciate that commitment to do so in a timely fashion. I'd like to tell you why I am asking this. I want to make certain that you can guarantee that not one dime of U.S. taxpayer funding is going to, the funding that's going to Gaza is going to benefit Hamas and their terrorist activities. Yeah. Has that happened? And I think the question I'd like to ask is, can you guarantee us that no taxpayer money, no U.S. taxpayer money went to fund the attack that Hamas delivered in Israel on October the 7th? Israel has said that Hamas is diverting foreign aid. Hamas has even demonstrated that with their own videos. Your own department has warned about the high risk. And I've yet to see, but I hope to, that where the actual funds flow is coming to Hamas from our government to Gaza. But I'm deeply concerned here, and we need to be convinced that we're not funding both sides of this war, that U.S. taxpayers aren't put in a position of funding a vicious cycle. And I think this department, I think your department needs to confirm that with this committee. We need that level of detail so that as we appropriate a massive request for funding, we can assess the risk ourselves, Mr. Secretary.
And Senator, we'll work with you on that, and we'll get you the information. I want to respond as robustly as we can to your letter. I also want to make sure that we are doing everything we possibly can for the 1 million children in Gaza who desperately need
I hear you.
Food,
I just don't want to see the U.S. taxpayer
support.
Funding both sides of this war
Mr.
in Israel
Secretary, and I hate to interrupt.
Thank you for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint.